Hey all, Mr. P here to talk to you today about conditional statements. Conditional statements are statements in geometry that use the words if and then to combine two different statements together. Those two different statements we call the hypothesis and the conclusion. And we're going to be dealing with both words and symbols here. So when we talk about a hypothesis, we give that the symbol P. And those are the words that are after if, and they come before then. And the conclusion is at the end. We give that the letter Q. And those are all the words that follow the word then. So if and then are sort of glue. They're sort of connecting words that combine a hypothesis and a conclusion. And so let me give you an example, and then I can show you some symbols. So if I have a statement P that says you watch the lesson, and a statement Q that says you will get credit. If I want to write that as an if-then statement, P is my hypothesis. That's going to go between if and then. Q is the conclusion. That's going to go at the end. And I have this conditional statement that says, if you watch the lesson, then you will get credit. Symbolically, we can write these as P arrow Q. We would read this as if P, then Q. So the arrow sort of tells us we have an if-then statement. Another way to put it is P implies Q. So it's important to be able to identify the hypothesis and the conclusion of each of a conditional statement, because in the future we're going to have to move those around a little bit. So in this conditional statement, we want to identify the hypothesis. That is all the stuff that comes between if and then. So the hypothesis is an animal is a robin. And the conclusion is everything that goes after the word then. The animal is a bird. And again, the hypothesis we call P, the conclusion we call Q. If we try this one, the hypothesis is between if and then. An angle measures 130 degrees. The conclusions are everything at the end. After then, the angle is obtuse. So here's a good time to tell you that if you're having a hard time listening and writing down the stuff at the same time, then you should use the pause button. So either listen to what I say and then pause and write everything down, or write everything down and then pause, rewind, and listen to what I say. So here's a place where I definitely want you to pause. I want you to pause. I want you to look at this green conditional statement, and I want you to identify the hypothesis and the conclusion, P and Q, just like we did, and then I want you to press play, and I'll go over the answer. So my hypothesis is everything between if and then. Two angles are vertical. My conclusion is everything that comes at the end after the word then. They share a vertex. Don't get hung up too much right now on the vocabulary. We can talk about this together in class. These are types of vocabulary words we'll get into though this year. One thing we might want to do to a statement is negate it, and you might think that that just means make it negative, but what I really mean is that we want to change the meaning, sort of give an opposite meaning. So here I have a conditional statement, and I want to negate the hypothesis and the conclusion. So my hypothesis here is two angles are vertical. And so in order to negate that, I have to change its meaning. So if two angles are vertical, then the opposite is two angles are not vertical. So that makes it the negation. And we give this little squiggly. It's not a negative symbol, it's like a squiggly, and that means negation. And if we want to negate the conclusion, they share a vertex. Well, we want it to be the opposite of sharing a vertex, so that would be not sharing a vertex. They do not share a vertex. So we can do this one similarly. This time you'll notice specifically the word not in the hypothesis and the conclusion. So if we want to negate something that has a not in it already, We don't give it another not. We just take the not out. So the hypothesis was an animal is not a robin. And so when we negate it, we take the not out and it just becomes an animal is a robin. Same idea for the animal is not a bird. If we want to negate the animal is not a bird, not Q, then we just say the animal is a bird. We're changing the meaning of the statement. So again, I want you to pause here, try this one. I want you to negate the hypothesis and conclusion like we just did on the previous page, and then press play when you're done to check your answer. So in order to negate an angle measures 90, we'll say something like an angle doesn't measure 90 degrees. You might write something like an angle isn't 90 degrees. That would have been okay. To negate the angle is not obtuse, we want to take that not out and say the angle is obtuse. That's the opposite meaning. So it's the negation of the conclusion. So make sure that if you get stuck at any point and you're confused, even if I've explained something, that you write your question down so you can ask me in class. So we've gone over quickly conditional statements, if P, then Q, just like I have here in red. And we have these related conditional statements, these three, purple, blue, and green. These are conditional statements, if-then statements that relate to the original. And we can create those by moving around P and Q and doing some negating like we just did on the previous couple pages. So if we switch P and Q, like I've done here in purple, we call that the converse. If P, and I made a mistake here, it should say if Q, then P. So instead of if P then Q, we say if Q then P. We switch the conclusion and the hypothesis. The inverse, you leave P and Q in the same spot, and instead we just negate each part, like we just did on the previous two slides. So if not P, then not Q. In the contrapositive, you do both of them. You switch their order, and you negate both statements. I put down here as a note that the original conditional and the contrapositive are always logically equivalent. And we can talk more about that later on. So let's practice writing some of these related conditionals, converse, inverse, and contrapositive. So I have my original conditional here in brown, and I can identify an angle measures 180 degrees as my P, and it is a straight angle is my Q. And so to create the converse, I just switch those two, and I get, if it is a straight angle, then an angle measures 180 degrees. If I want to write the inverse of this original statement in brown, I leave the green and the blue, the hypothesis and conclusion, right where they are, but I negate them like we did previously in this lesson. So I get, if an angle doesn't measure 180 degrees, then it is not a straight angle. If I want to write the contrapositive, I need to do both. I need to negate both of them and then switch their order. And so I get, if it is not a straight angle, then an angle doesn't measure 180 degrees. Another way to think about creating the contrapositive is if you take the inverse and you just switch its order, you'll end up with the contrapositive. And again, this contrapositive is logically equivalent to the original conditional statement. So I want you to pause here one last time, one last one to do on your own, and then when you're finished, press play and listen to me give your answers. Please pause here. It's very important that you pause and try this one on your own, and you don't just watch me do it only. So my hypothesis is this month is June. My conclusion is next month is July. So to write the converse, I switch both of those. And I'll point out too that if and then stay right where they are. We always start the sentence with if, and then is in the middle. To get the inverse, we negate both of them. And then to get the converse, we switch them and negate them. So I hope you were able to understand this lesson. If you weren't able to understand any parts, please make sure you write down questions that you can ask me in class, and I'll absolutely answer them, and we'll have plenty of time to practice this and fix any mistakes that you might have. I do have a couple problems that I want you to answer that are connected to this lesson, and so make sure you answer those before you are done.